Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the library tour of Doom. This is a library tour of every book in my library, past, present, and yet to come, conducted by myself and Lord Ganesha. And today we are doing another example of the type of book where I want to show it to you. I've had it, I've read it many times, but I don't actually have a copy at the moment. I'm a little bit amazed by that, considering how important this book was to me at various points in my life. What we're talking about here is by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, The Great Bird of the Galaxy, and this is The Making of Star Trek. Can you make it out there? A mass market paperback from 1968 that I have had many times. It's not made anymore, it's not in print anymore, and of course mass market paperbacks like this more and more aren't made anymore as the reading public dwindles and as production costs soar. It once upon a time was possible for you to walk into a drugstore and get these things on a metal spinner rack for not a significant chunk of your monthly mortgage. That isn't so much true anymore. If a book costs more or the same as a meal, you're probably going to take the meal instead. But once upon a time, that was possible, and I got this book when it came out, and have had many copies since. I don't know why I don't have a copy now. Maybe I'm just waiting for the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston to disgorge a big treasure trove of Star Trek mass market paperbacks, so that I can get a copy from that. I don't need the whole of the trove, although if that ever happens, and that might happen, I might be tempted one way or another. This is the story of, as the title suggests, the making of the TV show, the original Star Trek. And Whitfield writes it in cooperation with, under the thumb of, under the watchful eye of, under the slightly deceptively benevolent smile of Gene Roddenberry, who was a heck of a guy. He was a wonderful guy, but he definitely didn't want any negative aspects of his own involvement in his own brainchild to come out in this book. They do still. If you read between the lines, you can tell that he wasn't always a basket of roses to deal with. But nevertheless, it's the reason I bring that up is because it is possible. Many Star Trek fans have pointed this out over the years. It is possible to imagine a book like this called The Making of Star Trek that is sort of a transporter malfunction evil double of this book. There have been oral histories that sort of point the way that have been great. But for a long-term Star Trek fan, for a Star Trek fan that was there from the beginning, nothing will ever really replace this book as an origin story for the show that they love so much. I don't know if this thing is going to let me. It might not let me do it. No, it won't. It won't let me do it. I'm afraid you're stuck with both the book and my darling little hippo. But you can sort of tell, and you can certainly Google this. It's been reprinted a million times. This is another example of what I was talking about when in the past I have talked about James Blish's adaptations of Star Trek episodes from the original show, where a book of them, a collection of, that had 7 episodes adapted in it for prose, a normal paperback would show up in a drugstore, dry goods store, dime store, whatever, and it would sell out. And by the time that series got to volume 3 or 4, it sold out immediately. It sold out that day or the next day. So the guy who's, the shop proprietor, he opens a box, or he has his son or his nephew open a box in the back room that's got an assortment of books in it. And that means that you're going to return the covers of the old books on the spinner rack and swap them out for new ones, unless you're conscientious and have kept track of what books that were there did well, in which case you might make the effort. It's not the same thing as groceries or lawnmower parts or whatever, but you might make the effort to maybe get more copies of that book. If there was 1 book or 2 books that did well, then you might just not replace the whole lot. You might get extra copies of those particular books, but usually not. Usually it was just, dump them and pump them. And when these things started coming out, when James Blish's Star Trek books, for instance, his little Star Trek books started coming out, just with numbers on them, those shop owners all across the country started realizing that they were selling out. They weren't just selling well, they were gone in 2 days. And people would be coming in asking. Fans of all types, not just kids, fans of all types would be coming in saying, the word has it that there's a new James Blish Star Trek volume. Is it here? Shop owners all over the country had to figure out what this was and get used to saying, No, I got 3 copies and sold them. It was the same thing with this. It went and went and went because we were desperate for more about this show that meant so much to us. This show that was such a revelation after so many years of watching so much garbage of science fiction nature on television and in the movies. Uh, and as such, this book holds a close place in my heart. Again, I am mystified why I don't have a copy of it. I've had everything here. I've had mass market paperbacks in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I bought this book in many states of the Union. I even once had a little mass market permabound hardcover. Someone had done the old library process of making a little hardcover out of a mass market paperback to make it more durable for lending and lending and lending. Someone had done that to a copy of The Making of Star Trek, and it had ended up in a used bookstore. I don't know how that could be. I don't imagine that in the early, that would have been in the late 1970s. I can't imagine in the late 1970s there was any librarian in the country who would have been progressive enough to want Star Trek in their permanent lending library, much less this book. One way or another, I've had many different editions of this thing, and yet I don't at the moment have an edition. And I know from this picture that it's been 10 years, 6 years at least, since I had an edition of this book. I don't know where it went. I don't know who I would have sent it to, but I judged the time period of the photo from the degree of whiteness on Lucy's face, and it's not total yet. There's still a little path of brown in between her big dumb eyes. There's still little islands of brown over her brows, and that allows me to roughly date this photo because the last 2 years of her life she didn't have any of that. She was as white as the driven snow all over her face. So this was probably 6 or 7 years ago at least. I have no idea who I would have sent it to, but it's gone. But anyway, the other point that I wanted to make about this book, in addition to it being probably the hands down sentimental favorite, there is one other. Those you old Star Trek fans will know. There's one other sort of behind the scenes Star Trek book that sold really well. It did as great as this book. We will be getting to it in this library tour of doom. But in terms of an emotional return to the origin story of this show, I don't think, just for sentimental reasons, that I would ever have a preference over this book. But in addition to that, in addition to it being that, it's also, the last time I reread it, which is probably when I took this picture, it's also a fantastic account of what it was like to put on a network TV show in the 60s, just in general, not just Star Trek, but what kind of compromises you have to make, what kind of last-minute catastrophes crop up, what kind of office politics you have to play with the producers and the money people up the chain. That is fascinating, and it makes me wish that we had more such accounts of that. I always say that. I don't know why we don't. I imagine it's because the people who could write those books still have to work in Hollywood. And if they do, they figure they'll be done. But the number of books that I've read like that, not sentimental, wasn't this a great urban legend, didn't we all know from the beginning? Not any crap like that, but actual biographies of TV shows. There was one about 10 years ago for the Mary Tyler Moore Show that was terrific, absolutely terrific, and that I didn't expect to happen. Because if I'm calling Gene Roddenberry smiling but and benevolent but controlling, then I'd need to come up with new words for Mary Tyler Moore along exactly those same lines. So I just assumed that no book like that would ever come out while she was alive. And it did, and it was terrific. And there was also one just a couple of years ago about the TV show Friends. I would love it if there were more. I understand the human reasons why there aren't, but that's another aspect of what makes this book so fascinating, is not so much just Star Trek, but network TV. So that's your Library Tour of Doom book for today. It's one I'm a little embarrassed to say that I don't have, considering that I was one of those original fans, and I watched and loved what I was seeing. Not immediately, not at first. Not at first. I don't want to stress that. But very soon after. Very soon after, probably 4 weeks of the show. It was probably the third or fourth week before I realized, okay, there are people who really care who are involved in this and want it to be consistent from one episode to the next. They want it to be smart. They're willing to let the audience do some of the work. I say that generously. People, of course, the vision was Gene Roddenberry's, but I'm pretty sure the people was probably singular, and it was probably Dorothy Fontana. But I could be wrong about that one way or another. Uh, that's your book for today. It's Star Trek. I'm not going to go on for 30 more minutes about Star Trek, and I will make a mental note that tomorrow's Library Tour of Doom will not be Star Trek, or we will be here forever. I'll find something else to talk about. Don't you worry. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.